All right, good afternoon, everyone. It is Wednesday, the 17th of June, and this is your weekly edition of our Iron Sharpening Iron webcast. And I'm just so tickled today. One of my favorite people in all the world is joining us all the way from the Pacific Northwest. We have Scott Beyer with us today. Scott, how you doing?
I am doing great. I am happy to be here, honored to be here. It is a weird world that lets us do stuff like this at weird times, but I'm thankful for opportunities like this to spend some time talking with my friends. So you and I, we don't get to see each other as often as we used to. So this is a treat for me.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. This type of platform is such a blessing because you and I used to, well, we didn't see each other too terribly regularly, but we would meet for coffee and those types of things and talk about difficult topics. And I do miss seeing you, but this is a great way to be able to interface for a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it's amazing how quickly everybody kind of became tech savvy. That's what amazes me. All the brethren, we have a whole mix everywhere you go. And some people are like, man, I hate using my cell phone or this or that, but when we had to, people stepped up. And so I have classes now and you have little old ladies hopping on Zoom. That's impressive to me,
Yeah,
so.
for sure. And uh, you know my dad pretty well. And my dad is not tech savvy at all. I mean, he can barely make a phone call on his smartphone. And when dad types, he's kind of he's one of these kind of typers. But lo
I've
and
seen him
behold,
text.
yeah, it's terrible. And here he got on Zoom and learned how to use it. And I was just so proud of him because we've had him on
That's
the
awesome.
webcast here. Yeah, it was really great. Scott, do me a favor. For those of us who are here in the Midwest and maybe have heard your name but don't know you, maybe take just a couple minutes and tell the folks a little bit about yourself and maybe how you and I got to know each other.
Yeah, so well, Bill goes all the way back to my conversion. So I was not raised in a Christian home, raised by parents who loved me, but um, I met what would eventually become my wife, Jenna, in high school, and I was converted at 17, and uh, in the congregation in Sumner, Washington. And Bill was attending there at the time. And so we got to know each other then. And then kind of our lives went different directions as I grew up and went off and started preaching in different places. And so I preached in a couple of different places after studying with the preacher there in Sumner. And then eventually ended up where I'm at now, which is Monroe, Washington. We're like 45 minutes east of Seattle. And I've been preaching here, coming up on 14 years, something like that. And Jenna and I have been married 20 years. I better get that right? I've been married 20 years.
I'll be more impressed if you know the day.
Yeah, it's July 12th. I got that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Extra points.
Extra points. Yeah. But we have 7 kids, which is probably for most people the thing that we are most known for, because you can't go into a grocery store or whatnot without people going, that's a lot of people. So we have 7 kids. Our oldest is biological, but the other 6 came home through adoption. And so our kids range from age 17 down to age 2. So we are very blessed. We didn't plan on going on the adoption journey. That wasn't like part of our roadmap, but it was part of God's roadmap. And we've been the better for it. God's plans are always better than our plans. So happily here in Monroe and just plinking along and preaching the gospel as best we can, connected to a really great group of brethren.
We have a handful of people watching with us on Facebook. If you have comments or questions for Scott, feel free just to put them in the comment section there, and I'll pass them along to Scott. He'd be all too happy to address your comments or questions. And Scott, I'm going to go there for just a minute because, I mean, I've known you for a long time, and I watched you, come out of high school and become the young man you are, and you are a stalwart there in the Northwest as far as soldiering for the Lord and sharing His word. But probably second to that, I do think of you as the guy with 7 kids.
It's okay.
And I say that lovingly because you and Jenna have done just such a wonderful job with your family, and you guys are such a diverse family, and now you've got kids all over this age spectrum, and really just couldn't be prouder to be your friend. And one of the things I wanted to talk with you about today and ask you to touch on is this whole idea of orphans, widows, adoption, and all that other kind of thing. And so maybe the best place to start is at the end of James chapter 1. Now, I had Brother Finley on a couple different occasions. And last time he and I talked about James chapter 1, and we didn't finish the last 2 verses. And I thought, well, this is a great spot for Scott to jump in and finish the chapter. And then maybe we can talk about just some practical slice of life kind of things, your family, and kind of how that has all come to pass in these last few years.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm glad Steve didn't cover those last couple of verses, because if he did, this would be a waste of time. Steve's so good at his Bible stuff that, you don't need me. But yeah, they're powerful verses. They've certainly been verses that have shaped my family, and I've spent a lot of time looking at them because for me, it's been a very practical, real life application that I've had to look at. What does God mean in James 1:27 in particular? I think 25, 26, and 27 all kind of go together.
Okay.
And I know you covered 25, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I think when he makes that point that when we look at that perfect law of liberty and abide by it, he says, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer. That effectual doer is kind of an interesting thing in the Greek. It's literally the word ergon means labor, and then do. And so it's like a working worker, a doing doer. And so, he's saying, which kind of Christian are you going to be? Are you going to be somebody who looks at the Bible and says, this is a really great academic thing, and let me put my scholar, spectacles on, and I will know all the right verses and know all the right doctrinal answers, and that's the extent of my Christianity? Or am I going to be a doing doer? And I think that's where he starts. And then verse 26, he talks about some of the things that we shouldn't do. Or let me put it this way. The first thing you should do if you're going to be a doing doer of the Bible is shut your mouth.
Yes. And it's interesting. He goes on in chapter 3 and talks about that more in depth.
Absolutely.
There is wisdom in that, right? There should be a decorum to our discipleship, and part of that decorum should not include being foolish with our speech.
Yeah, there's an acronym, WAIT, WAIT, and it stands for Why Am I Talking? And it's a good question to ask ourselves, probably us preachers more than anything else. I've been in the pulpit and thought, why am I still talking? This sermon should have been done 10 minutes ago. And that's the idling of the tongue. It's a hard thing once you have the floor, so to speak, to cede it to somebody else. And so here, if anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. That's a really powerful statement, because I think if we're not careful, that's what we do. We talk a lot about God, and so we talk so much that we convince ourselves we must be faithful. But being faithful is not it's not just what comes out of your mouth. And sometimes it's about not saying anything and getting about the work, putting your hand to the plow.
I've always told my kids just kind of a practical slice of life kind of thing. And having daughters, I thought this was important for them to know. I'd say, do not judge a person based on what they say, right? Judge a person based on their actions, because the actions always tell the truth. How many times have you met somebody who's said 100 times, oh yeah, I'll take care of that, I'll get on that next week, and they keep saying it, they never do it. It's the action that is more truthful than the words. So I've always told them to kind of watch out for that. A person's behavior is always more truthful than the things that they say.
Absolutely. And we have practical axioms in society that we say, actions speak louder than words. That exists for a reason. I think that's part of what's being gotten at when you look at the qualifications for deacons, even because it mentions with deacons, if a man's going to be qualified to be a deacon, let him first be tested. And that is, it's not testing his words. It's give him a job, see if he actually does the job. And then you can talk about putting him in the position of being a deacon on a long-term basis. I think there's a lot of people who say, yeah, of course I would. But the doing is that's a better indicator of who you are, right?
Yeah, I had a high school English teacher who at 90 something is still pretty active on Facebook. But I remember in class.
I love that, by the way.
Yeah, that's awesome. And everybody still calls him Mr. Kelly. Nobody calls him by his name. It's Mr.
Mr. Kelly. That's great.
But one of the things he said to me one time in class is he said, talk is cheap. Show me. I was like, wow, how profound, right? But isn't that kind of the premise of verse 22? If we go back to James 1 and look at verse 22, he says, prove yourselves to be doers of the word, not merely hearers who delude themselves. As you look at verse 22 through the end of the chapter, do you look at this and conclude that we need to have a religion that is a practical, practicing religion? It involves us doing something on our part.
If I could nod my head so hard that my head shook off, I would, because that's absolutely what it has to be. Christianity has to be practical. If it's not, we're missing the point. Everything that Jesus did was practical, even down to, well, what's it going to take to save these people? I guess somebody's going to have to go down there. Somebody's going to have to live in this world. Somebody's going to have to eat dirt and grow up poor and deal with all of the problems of people and all of the temptations. And then somebody's got to be nailed to that cross. Like there was a practical conversation had in the heavenly realm at some point about there's going to be a wooden cross and one of us is going to be nailed to it. And that's the only way. That is even at the heart of Christianity, which is the cross and Jesus on it, that's practical. It doesn't happen by talking about saving people. It happens by doing it. We love because he first loved us. And so everything we do has to be the same way. It has to emulate that pattern he's given us. Otherwise, we are, like you said in verse 22, we're just deluding ourselves. And every relationship is that way. Yeah, I mean, you think about your relationship with your spouse. Does your wife want you to say you're going to take out the trash, or does she want you to actually do it? Does she want you to say you'll mow the lawn, or does she want you to actually do it?
Right.
So
no, great practical application. I know at my house how those questions are answered.
I think we know how it happens in all of our houses.
Yeah. If there's any of you guys watching at home, if you say you're going to do it, you might want to follow through with that, or you'll score many, many points in the bank with your spouse. And by the way, for those of you who are tuning in here recently, we're with my good dear friend Scott Beyer way up in Monroe, Washington. And we're going to be talking about James chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Scott, let me throw you a nice big softball here. In verse 27, he starts out by saying, pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this. All right, so if you want to know what pure and undefiled religion is, it's these two things here. He says, visit orphans and widows in their distress and keep oneself unstained by the world. Can you maybe take a little time and talk about that? What does it mean to visit orphans and widows?
So one of the things that I look for in everything I do in life is I'm looking for the easy money. So Dave Ramsey has a big thing where he talks about with your finances, if your employer will match the money, that's free money. I want free money in life. I want anything I can do that I know is a win. James 1:27 is one of those verses. It's look, you can't go wrong with doing these things. If you do this, God will definitely be pleased. Pure and undefiled. You don't get any purer, you don't get any cleaner than this. And then when he says, there's really two things. There's the visiting the widows and orphans, and then there's the keeping oneself unstained from the world. So those are kind of two things. You're never going to go wrong if you pursue either one of these. And practically speaking, we should be pursuing both at the same time. It's not an either or. It's an and. So with the widows and orphans, when he says to visit widows and orphans in their distress, that word visit is it's a fun word in the Greek. I'm not always a, hey, let's go to the Greek guy, but this is one that I think is. It comes from two Greek words that are just combined together. We have English words that we do this where we combine them together and then you get a new word. The two Greek words are epi and skopos. Epi means upon or at or in. It's a prepositional word. But then the other word is skopos, and it's where we get the word scope, like telescope. It means to look at intently with the view of seeing. What he's literally saying here is pure and undefiled religion is to see widows and orphans, these people in need, and actually see them. And the reason that I think that that's so powerful is if there's two groups of people who are easy to go unseen, they're kind of the invisible of society. Right. It's a widow who has nobody to care for her or advocate for her, and an orphan who has nobody to advocate and care for. We all know that there are widows and orphans out there, right? But they're very easy to kind of talk about in a vague, indistinct way. There's widows, and if there was a widow, I would do something, or there was an orphan, I would do something. And in fact, I would say that for me, that was the vast majority of my life up until about 10 years ago. But then there is the practical side of, are you actually seeing them? We've got some friends who adopted out of they adopted out of Bulgaria, and she likes to say, when people say, well, of course I want to help the widows and the orphans. If there was an orphan, I would absolutely help him. She says, I am here to tell you, I know exactly where 9,000 are, because that's how many are in the Bulgarian orphanages where they went. It's not a imaginary number. These are real people. They're real children. And what's easy to do with the most disenfranchised or oppressed or alone people is to ignore them. And we do it sometimes for good reasons. I can say that, or at least reasonable reasons, it seems like.
Okay.
The problem's too big. Sometimes that's one of the clearest reasons. Last stat I saw is about 150 million orphans in the world.
Wow.
It's a big number. In the state of Florida, there 67% of the criminals in the correctional facilities have done time in the foster system first, 67%.
Wow, that is amazing.
So these are big numbers, right? And it becomes like, where do we even go with that? When a problem is that big on the macro scale, our tendency is to go, well, let's let somebody else take care of that and just kind of move on, right? But I don't think that's the answer for us as Christians.
So what is the answer then? And actually let me throw just a couple puzzle pieces at you and maybe we can put them together.
Absolutely.
As I'm looking at James chapter 1, I think one of the things that stands out to me, I prefaced this conversation by asking you, does this passage seem to imply that there's something we need to do on our part? And I think if you look at the pronouns starting in verse 23, going down to verse 27, it's clear that this is individual work, right? Just like Galatians chapter 6 is talking about personal work. This is a personal responsibility. Okay, now that's one puzzle piece. Is it the responsibility of the local church to take on this work? Or does the local church have other things that it is supposed to focus attention on? And then if that's the case, then how do we handle the issue of orphans?
Yeah, so there's been a debate for a very long time as to what should churches as a local group do with their treasury. And as much as I am for very much pro-adoption, pro-taking care of the fatherless, I don't see anywhere in the text where James or anywhere else is saying that the churches should be using their treasury to go do that. I think that's passing the buck, actually. So the old argument used to be that people who say the church shouldn't use its money to take care of orphans, they don't really have orphanages in America so much anymore. There's a couple of kind of hang-ons there, to be technical about it, but overall, that's not even a practical issue anymore, because churches don't have orphanages to give their money to, but they used to. And they used to say, so people who were opposed to that, it's like, you're the kind of person who would just take a baby and they put it on the church doorstep and you just kick it off the doorstep. No, we're not doing that. And my argument is, no, I'm going to do what God said, which is pick the kid up and I'm going to take it to my house. Like that's what we're called to do as Christians. This idea that the church should do the work and we just write the check is not biblical. It is lazy. And I know that's a bit blunt, but that's really how I feel about it. When we go, well, I'm making so much money and I'll just write a check. That's how you get into the pastor system. The denominational mentality of let's just hire a guy and he'll do all that stuff.
Right.
That's not biblical. We're not supposed to be write a check Christians. Now, you're going to feel like I'm maybe talking out both sides of my mouth here a little bit. I do think that we should, as Christians, use our money as a tool to do good. I do think it's good for Christians to support organizations that are doing things like this, but we should be doing it individually, right. Not just, I'll write it to the church and the church will take care of that.
Well, I think you're bringing up a really great point. The work of the local church is to preach the gospel to the lost, teach and train those who are already saved so they can make more disciples, and then to provide a little bit of benevolence to needy Christians.
Right.
That's the limitations and the scope of the work of the local church. Now let me throw another puzzle piece at you, because my question is, if it's not the responsibility of the church corporate to do the work, then can the church corporate pay a third-party entity to do the work that it's responsible for in its local community?
Yeah, the answer to that is no, right? Because if I'm not supposed to do something, I'm not allowed to use my money to go do that thing either, because that's still me doing it in some way. Right. So when you talk about 1 Timothy 5 is a classic example of this. The church does have a right to care for widows who are widows indeed. So that is something that would fit into the benevolence category. It's very clearly stated that churches, if there is a widow indeed, she meets these certain qualifications, being over a certain age, being truly alone, that's something that the church should do. But then in that same text where Paul is explaining that, he says, but if there's other people who can do it, if there's somebody else who can care for that widow, whether it be her own children or even a member of the church that's been caring for her, let them do it instead, that the church be not burdened. So there's a principle that the church is not, it's not just, hey, we shouldn't be doing these things. It's, we have, as you've stated, 3 very specific things we're supposed to be doing. And if we start doing other stuff, we're burdening the church down so it can't do the stuff it needs to. You take like the American Heart Association, nobody bats an eye when the American Heart Association doesn't give money for taking care of, cancer. They deal with heart issues. That's right. It's in the name, right? They're American Heart Association, and the American Cancer Society doesn't use their money to take care of heart patient issues. Nobody blames them for that or says they're somehow, anti-helping people with heart issues or anti-helping people with cancer. They just have a very specific mission, and that's good. They've chosen to pursue that mission. And so their donors in particular need to know where that money's going to go, and that they're going to take a laser focus to the job and the mission of the organization. Our primary donor to the church is Jesus. He gave his blood, and he has to have confidence in our laser focus in his mission. And then on top of that, the brethren who are also donating to the treasury need to have confidence that the money will be spent to go about the Lord's work, because they didn't give it to us, they gave it to the Lord. So there's nothing wrong with the church saying, this is our job and we're going to stay in our lane. But then when you talk about individual Christians, that door of doing good things opens up a lot wider, right? So you have the church with a very narrow focus but as Christians, we have a very wide focus in terms of how we can do good to all men, especially the household of faith.
Let me interrupt you for just a minute. We've had several new people tune in here. We are with Scott Beyer out in Monroe, Washington. Those of you in the Northwest know Scott, but my 4 Scott friends, you've probably heard me mention Scott a time or two. This is your chance to get to know Scott a little bit. If you have questions or comments for Scott regarding the topic we're talking about, please drop them in the comment section so I can share them with him. All right, Scott. So what I heard you saying is that the church has a very narrow scope and focus of the work it's supposed to do in its local community. I also heard you say that the church cannot pay a third-party entity to do the work that its members are responsible for. So then, and here's another puzzle piece. Let's plug this into our puzzle. It is my understanding that with maybe just a few anomalies, there are not orphans in America. Is that a relatively true statement?
No, that's not even close. No, there definitely are orphans in America, for sure.
Right, but we don't have orphanages.
Oh, orphanages, right? Yes. No, we don't really have. There's a couple of, like I said, holdovers, but in general, no, we don't have orphanages. We moved to a foster system model here in America, and that model is what you'll predominantly see. It has some strengths and it has some weaknesses to it. One of the strengths to it is putting kids who are in an at-risk circumstance into a environment that hopefully will mimic a family, right? So they'll have foster parents and some sort of kind of family structure that somewhat resembles the biblical model is the hope. So that's, I think, a real strength to it. One of the weaknesses to it is most of us who went to any sort of traditional public school didn't realize that we were surrounded by orphans the whole time.
Right.
You probably had, growing up, some kid who was always picked up by his aunt or his uncle.
Yeah.
And you didn't realize it, but that's their foster parent. That's a very common thing for foster parents to have the kids call them Aunt so-and-so or Uncle so-and-so. And so you didn't realize it, but they were all around you. And so in one ways, it gets back to what James is saying, to visit, to see them, to really see them. It is a little bit harder in America, I think, to really see the fatherless, because we built a system that can make it so they kind of blend in. There's some strengths to that, but there's also some weaknesses. And I think one of the primary weaknesses is we can kind of delude ourselves into thinking, oh, well, there's not a problem because I don't see it. Well, that then if we don't see the problem, we tend to not do anything about it.
In my personal research and making phone calls and talking to people and asking questions, even you and I are aware of the Bowles Orphan Home in Texas many, many years ago. They still exist. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that they don't call themselves Bowles Orphan Home anymore. It's Bowles Youth Home. And, we know we have a brother who used to preach in the Northwest that works at a youth home in Colorado, right? They're not called orphanages anymore because those institutions that used to care for orphans are now taking in like at-risk youth kids who are coming maybe out of incarceration. These are kids coming out of maybe halfway houses and, trying to reacclimate so they can go back to their families.
Right.
So if that then is a true statement, why are churches still giving money to them as if they are taking care of orphans?
Because it makes us feel good. That's why. It makes us feel good.
That was too short an answer.
Sorry, I know, but I mean, that really is it, right? Why do we do things that are close to biblical, but not actually biblical, that we don't actually have authority for, but it feels like it? Why did the Pharisees wash their hands all the time and wash everything? Because it felt pious.
Right.
It's the exact same thing. So what you have is churches have turned into, it's a real danger. They've replaced Christianity with community activism. And community activism says, if we're doing something that's good for the community, whether it be, we adopt a highway, so we clean up all the litter on the highway, or political activism. We have the conventions or whatnot at our house or at the church building there, something like that. We feel like we're making the community a better place. And when we do that, we feel good, but we're not actually doing God's will. So we're deluding ourselves. And I think that's one of the things that has really happened, is that churches have found things that make them feel good about themselves without actually doing the hard stuff.
I feel like maybe this is a two-pronged problem, and help me out here for a second. I feel like the first problem is that churches are spending their treasury resources on things that are outside the narrow scope of their focus, right? Preaching, teaching, and providing some benevolence to Christians. All right. The second thing is you have Christians who are lazy, right? If I put my $5 in the collection plate, that relieves me of my personal responsibility. And then I'll let somebody else, whether it's the church or it's the third party that the church pays to do the work that it thinks it ought to be doing, so that I don't have to do anything. But that's really contradictory to the last section of James 1, right? Starting with verse 22.
Yes, I agree. And it is a two-pronged thing. So on one hand, we have a lack of knowledge. We have people who don't, what we've not done is we've not done enough teaching on what is the responsibility of the individual and what is the responsibility of the church. But I think that that's actually even the lesser of the two problems. The bigger problem is the second one you mentioned, which is that people have, they feel bad. And this is a good thing. God has designed us to have a conscience and
Right.
to feel bad when we see injustice in the world. Nobody watches, I don't know if they even have them, but do you remember the old, send 10 cents a day to feed a kid in Africa? Those old
for sure.
commercials. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get a picture and little blurb about
right.
the kid or something.
Yeah. And there was always they always had a picture of a kid there, and there's like a fly going around their face the whole time. It's like, it was meant to trigger an emotional response in you. And it worked, by the way.
Right.
It worked really well. I mean, that organization, I can't even remember the name of it anymore, but they, whether they're still around or not, for a very long time, they were putting those out because it worked. We are supposed to have that sort of emotional response to injustice, to poverty, to pain, to the suffering of this broken world, especially the least of these, to use a phrase of Jesus. But what you do with that emotional reaction is the hard part. Most of us, and I'm not trying to say everybody else, this is me included. I do this exact same thing, is you have that emotional response, and then your thought is, what do I need to do to make that feeling go away? Not what do I need to do my bit to lean into the heart and actually do what I can to help fix it. But how do I make the pain that I'm feeling right now, because I'm uncomfortable, because I'm sitting on my comfortable couch and I'm seeing this kid who's starving in another third world country, and I feel bad. I was eating my Doritos and now they don't taste good. So how do I get back to where I can enjoy life again? And those commercials gave you the answer, which is, well, just send us some money and it'll be better. And so we appease our conscience, we placate it with a small deed that, practically speaking, doesn't really do a lot to fix it.
Right.
What we need to do as Christians is get back to saying, when we feel that pang of injustice and horrible things going on in the world, that it's a broken world, what am I going to do to actually be the answer? And dig into that, instead of, like you said, it's sit on the couch, and it's a laziness thing. And look, I'm as guilty as the next guy, but it is a tendency to just want to make ourselves feel better.
One of the problems with supporting a third-party organization is that, in my mind, it feels like if you had a 5-year-old orphan in front of you and you said, okay, little Jimmy, here's $5. Now make your way over to McDonald's and get yourself a Happy Meal, which I don't even think you can get a Happy Meal for $5 anymore, but that's not the point. The $5 for the Happy Meal is not what Jimmy needs, right? What does that young child actually need that he's not getting? Would you agree that what he really needs is a family to take him in and take care of him?
Yes, absolutely. That's what kids need. In the same way that widows need more than just a meal brought to them. Widows need more than just a casserole every on once in a while on occasion. They need people to sit with them and talk with them and care about them.
Yes, they do.
So this is the practical side of Christianity. Is and I will also say, I'm not expecting by any means everybody to take the route that I've taken, right? I'm not saying that everybody needs to go and have a family of 7. That's not the point. But there are ways to support kids who are in a situation where they need people. They don't just need, like you said, a Happy Meal. They need people to bring happiness into their life. Be a mentor. The Boys and Girls Club still has, I think, the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. I'm pretty sure that still exists. Yep. Those are options. Volunteer in schools. You will find, so one of the practical sides of kids who are in the foster system is they are disproportionately going to be in the after school care programs and the before school care programs. Volunteer. You can make a connection and actually make a difference in these kids' life. You can be a role model and a figure in their existence. It's not, James 1:27 doesn't say you need to adopt every orphan. It said you need to see them. You need to see them and start to care for their needs. And the truth is, and I say this as somebody who has gone on this journey with older children, especially, the trauma that they have faced in not having God's model of a family from birth, that trauma, you can't fix all of that. I can't fix all of that. That's like a process they're going to have to go through with their life, but I can do something. And that's the answer, is we should be doing something. And so it doesn't have to be adoption. It can be, big brothers, big sisters. It can be, volunteering to be a part of a school's after school care, volunteering to do sports. That's another thing. That's an opportunity. If you can coach kids, you don't have to have kids, by the way, to coach a kids sports league. In fact, for those of us who have kids, it's kind of nice when there's somebody else who'll do that. So, but there's lots of opportunities there, and look for ways to give your finances as well. There are organizations that we as individual Christians can support that are getting to the heart of the problem. I know for our family, we have been supported by Sacred Selections, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit if you want to later on. But they're an organization that is a nonprofit run by Christians, but not a part of the church, simply to raise funds to cover the legal fees of adoption. Our family was in a position to adopt, but not in a financial position to. One of the things that is pretty common is raising kids is for younger people, but having money is for older people. So when you're young enough to adopt and raise kids, you're also broke enough to not be able to afford it. So Sacred Selections is one organization that kind of connects those two, right? Older Christians who go, I couldn't raise a kid. I'm not at the stage of life, but I could help finance the process of putting an actual child into an actual Christian home.
Yeah, I want to talk about this just a little bit more, but let me digress just a little bit real quickly.
Yep.
I really appreciate you bringing up the idea that, okay, you might not be able to afford to donate some money to a nonprofit. You might not be in a position to be able to adopt, but your time, volunteering and offering different ways in which people can do that. Because I think that's so critical, because there are plenty of young people in foster care, and even those who aren't in foster care, but young people who are just starved for the right kind of attention. And the sad thing is if they don't get the right kind of attention, at a certain age, they'll go find it in destructive ways. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to share real quickly, here we have a community college that has a football team. It's kind of a stepping stone for some young men to get their grades up and then go on and play like Division I football or whatever. So these are some pretty talented guys, but I had a chance to meet about half of the football team before the quarantine situation came along. And, a great number of those young men do not have male role models in their lives, be it that dad's incarcerated or absconded, no grandparents, and so what you see is that you see them gravitate towards you, and there's just no end to the amount of time and energy that you could volunteer for to be a role model to some young people. And so then let's take our last few minutes together then and kind of come back and let's talk about Scott. And let's talk about your family. Now,
my least favorite topic, but okay, sure.
Of course, I've known you and Holly since you were both fresh out of high school. And I'm sorry, I met Jenna. Your
That's
daughter is
okay. That
Holly.
happens all the time. Yes. Jenna is my wife. Holly is my oldest daughter.
That's right. And then one day you guys added to your family and now have added several more children to your family through the adoption process. Maybe take a couple of minutes and tell us how y'all came to that decision to begin adopting and increasing the size of your family. And then maybe we can talk a little bit more about sacred selections and how people can donate to them.
Sure. So Jenna and I, when we got married, we had talked actually about adoption before we even had Holly biologically. And what we had done is we had done what we thought was the route, which is we went and took the foster certification classes. And in that process of taking those classes, they tell you about the circumstances and you go through the training, and we looked at each other and we go, this is way over our head. I mean, the sorts of emotional struggles and turmoils that those kids were facing, we just did not feel equipped to do right by them. And we also were really concerned about, well, one of the things they talk about quite often is if you foster to adopt, the child is not legally free when they enter your home. So there is a possibility you will foster them and then they will go back to their biological parents, which, by the way, is a good thing. Reunification is not a bad thing, but it is a hard thing if you have in your mind, we're going to adopt and this is our child, and then all of a sudden they go back to their biological parents. So we backed away from that, had Holly. And then what we kind of said is we're only going to have one kid. And we would say it jokingly, if we ever got a call about a child that needed a home, of course we would say yes. That would be the Christian thing to do,
Right.
But I think we were just like everybody else. It's easy to say that, but realistically, that's not how that works. Well, in our case, it was how it worked. We did get a call. There was a Christian who had been at a ladies' study and found out about a child, and that was in need of a home. The child was going to be born soon, and so they called us and said, "Hey, I this came up, and I said that you'd be willing to," and and so they were talking to Jenna, and we got off the phone. We said, "Well, sure," but the first thing that we realized at that point was we have no idea how to do this because it's all theory. If we get a call, we would certainly say yes, but it's not like you just go pick up the kid at the 5 and dime, right? That's not how that works, So it's so we had to all of a sudden figure out, like, what would that look like? Well, that child ended up not becoming a Beyer. That child actually was born and passed away in the hospital. So that didn't come to be. But what did come out of that, what was God's gift out of that tragedy to us, was that we realized we needed to do some things. We needed to get a home study, which is you hire a social worker and they investigate your life and they meet you and they make sure your house is appropriate and that your marriage is appropriate. By the way, talk about adoption. Adoption isn't for everybody. One group it's not for is somebody who is, your marriage isn't solid. You need to have that part figured out. Do not adopt to fix your marriage. That doesn't work.
No, it doesn't.
And so that's one of the things I want to say. Hey, do you have a strong marriage? And Jenna and I are not perfect, but we do love each other, and we've got God, and that gave us some rails to run on. And so we knew we needed to do that. We knew we needed to get an adoption lawyer. And so there were these steps that we needed to take. Well, we took those so that if we ever got another call, we'd be ready. And we did end up getting another call. And I'm convinced that what happens is this. God, just like Paul told Timothy, that he asked him, he said, to be a vessel prepared for every good work. You get prepared and then the work shows up. Right. And so that's what had happened, is we got prepared. And then when there was a need, we did have the home study ready. We did have a lawyer lined up. We were ready and able to go. And so that led to our first child coming home. And that then ended up connecting us to a nonprofit called Sacred Selections, run by some Christians who at the time lived in California. They now live in Tennessee. We started to realize that this is a bigger world. The adoption world is a bigger world, and there's real needs, and those needs weren't going away. And we had a table with some extra seats at it. And that's, I look at it this way. For me, it is very simple. I wish I could say that it was just out of the goodness of my heart. I was such a great philanthropic kind of guy. That's not really it. I am, once again, very practical. I do not want to get to the judgment day and have God say, I had one more for you. That's what terrifies me.
Yeah.
I've got to meet God, and he's going to say, Scott, I gave you a table with so many seats in it. Why didn't you fill them with the least of these?
Right.
And I will say on top of that it's not like the kid benefits the most. I benefit the most. I mean, truly, people like to tell you, oh, you're just such great people for what you've done. And it's like, no, you don't get it. I have been more blessed by my children than I could ever be a blessing to them. I mean, it really is truly that way. And so once you figure that out, the rest of it just starts to fall into place. And
tell us about if you would, just first names. You can the names of your children in the order in which you brought them home.
Okay, so Holly, our oldest, is 17, biological,
and wonderful girl, by the way. She is her mama's daughter for sure.
She is, and she makes us look really good. We're really proud of her and all that kind of stuff. She graduated this year in pandemic style and everything, so we're really proud of her. So then the second to come home is Gus, and he is 9 now. The third to come home is Libby, and she's 10. She's 2 months older than Gus. So there's a kind of a birth order thing that changed. Then after Libby came home, Vaughn came home.
Right.
And Vaughn is 13.
Wow.
And yeah, I know, teenager. He's a good teenager, but it still kind of hit me when he turned 13. I
feel like he was just still like 9 or 10 the last time I saw him. So
yeah, it's amazing how quickly he goes. He's turning out to be quite a stout fellow. We wrestle like father and son, and now I have to be thoughtful about it because he's getting a little bigger. Then after Vaughn came home, we adopted Clarity. Her nickname's Cozy, so you might hear me switch the two. But Cozy is now 5.
Wow.
And she came home at birth. She was born premature, and she was kind of the entrance for us dealing with more medically complicated children. She's totally healthy now. I mean, she has a couple of little things, but nothing that affects her quality of life whatsoever. And then after her, Eve came home. Eve is 2. And she was born at 23 weeks, and she was 1 pound, 1 ounce. She's probably our most well-known child, yes, I guess, in the community, because her journey was 100 days in the hospital. We met her a few days after she was born. My wedding ring went all the way up her arm. If you look at a number 2 Ticonderoga pencil, she was not even that long. And so she spent 100 days in the hospital in Arizona. Jenna flying back and forth all the time to be with her. And then she came home, and she is a robust, sassy 2-year-old at this point. She is super healthy, doing great, and a perfect model of exactly why abortion is wrong.
She was a wonderful story. And I remember so many of us followed her journey very, very closely. And I'm so happy to hear that she's just a normal, troublesome 2-year-old.
That is exactly what she is. She's a normal, troublesome 2-year-old. That's exactly it.
All right. Yeah. Now, you were supposed to come on this podcast here recently, and I had to replace you with my dad. And
which was probably a
people
good
had,
move in general, but
oh no, the people have to suffer through Pops for an hour. And that is because you were out of town. Why don't you tell us what was going on?
so our last adoption happened right in the middle of the COVID, national crisis here. We got a call out of Florida, so just about as far on the map from Washington as you could get, of our son Ike. He is 4, and he just came home, and so we had to fly to Florida. Spend 3 weeks there. That was a little longer than we expected to, but it was just kind of the nature of how things went. Some of that was affected by COVID. Some of that was extra time was affected by bureaucracy. That's
Right.
was part of it too. But then we've now been home, I guess coming up on a month or something like that now. And he's just doing great. He is transitioned really well in the household, and he's just a really cool little guy. And I can't wait for you to meet him someday. One of these days we'll have a chance to get together, maybe when you're in town visiting your folks or something.
I will be there for about 10 days, the first part of October. So I look forward to seeing all your family and being able to meet Ike. For those of you who are watching and you cringe at the idea of adopting kids, I want you to know I've been over to Scott and Jenna's house several times, and that operation is a well-oiled machine. And
it's a Jenna run house.
It is a Jenna run house, but just she has such a gentle way, loving but gentle and firm. And that house is a well-oiled machine. I'm sure now I'm not there at bedtime or first thing in the morning, so perhaps maybe it's a little bit different at different times of the day. But you guys do a wonderful job, Scott, and I am just so proud of you guys for what you have done. And when I look back at James chapter 1, verse 22, I see 2 people who are walking the walk, who are living their faith, and you guys do such a wonderful job.
Oh, well, that's kind of you to say. That's the hope, right? I mean, I think all of us as Christians, that's what we want to do, is to be the kind of people that we read about. My hope for every Christian is that as you read the stories of faithful people in the New Testament and the Old Testament, don't just think, wow, those people were great. I think what we should try and do is say they were normal people. I mean, it's once again back in James where he talks about Elijah, and he says he was a man with a spirit like ours. He prayed and it made a difference. So the emphasis is we're no different. I think that our stories, though not written in the New Testament, can certainly be written down in history as part of God's people. It's the unwritten record of the faithful, and that's what we all want to be. Is we can do the things that they have done. We can live by faith just like they did. It's not just something that happened once. It's happening today in 2020 as much as it was happening in the first century.